Namaste, Namaskaram, Namaskar, good evening. So, I apologize for my appearance here. I have a losing battle by the end of the day. It is what it is. I'm sure Professor Balram Singh will appreciate what I'm saying here. So, going to talk in a completely different field from what you've been hearing so far. I've been hearing amazingly intellectual talks on consciousness and quantum mechanics and physics and so on. This is a completely different tack over here. We're going to talk about culture as a knowledge continuum. And I'm proposing a civilizational framework for understanding Indian culture. And before I start, Om Shri Gurubhyo Namaha. My pranams to hundreds of teachers whose works have enlightened us. A little bit about me. I have a PhD in EE, 30 years of experience, and I've offered more than 300 lectures on the Indian civilization, more than 20 teacher training workshops, and I'm a visiting faculty at Hindu University of America, Rishi Hood University, as well as Arsha Seva Kendram. Because many of you don't know my works, I thought I'll give one slide on the kind of work that I do. So I have four main areas of research and outreach. The first one is multidisciplinary investigation of the antiquity of the Indian civilization. The second major area is on the historicity of Indian knowledge systems. The third one is the knowledge transmissions and the impact of Indian knowledge systems on the world, literally. And the final area is decolonization studies. I was talking to David earlier and saying that I wish I'd known my audience a little better. So most of my talk is aimed at Indian audiences, but then I think the audience here will also appreciate when we talk about decolonization, what exactly goes through an Indian mind when we talk about decolonization studies. And today's talk is more or less in that area. And here are a sample of some of my talks. I'm going to be talking to you today on defining culture itself and the dimensions of Indian culture, the knowledge systems, social institutions, art, aesthetics, transmission, how the West defines culture, which is different from how Indians see culture, to deracination, to the resilient Vedic culture, and finally strengthening and so on. So first of all, because I claim that culture is a knowledge continuum, I need to first define what culture itself is. So Swami Chinmayananda said that very nicely. He said, when a group of people live together for a long time in a particular geographical area, living certain values, the special fragrance that emanates from that group is said to be their culture. Now, that is a very nice way of putting what culture could mean. And we'd like a little deeper explanation over here. So if we look at the etymology of the word culture itself, we see that it derives from the Sanskrit word kulachar. Now, kulachar has got the root meaning of the conduct of a lineage or a sampradaya, how they behave and so on. And it's also got the root meaning of turning or moving. And the cognate that we identify is with culture. This became the Latin word colliere. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. And it came to have the meaning of cultivating the land. And it acquired a meaning of cultura. By the 15th century, it was called cultura. During the European Enlightenment era, Thomas Hobbes, he used culture to plow the human mind. So it comes closer to our modern meaning of culture as civilized and refined behavior. And for us, we're going to see it as a corpus of shared values, beliefs, morals, ethics, and all of these things, which has material aspects as well as non-material aspects. And the important thing to see here is culture is not stagnant. It is not some shastras or not something that was set in stone and so on. It's a dynamic thing. It evolves over time. So my proposed framework is that culture is knowledge plus the worldview plus the practice that is sustained over many centuries. So in terms of knowledge, we can see, for example, the Bharatiya civilization that has got scientific content, philosophical, artistic, and a whole lot of knowledge systems that are transmitted over here. In its worldview, we see the cosmological frameworks and how the civilization itself understands time, space, causality, and so on. And in practice, the living enactment through rituals, art forms, and these kinds of things. And we see that culture is a living mechanism to encode, to preserve and to transmit civilizational understanding. And many people ask me, so what exactly is civilization if you're talking about culture as being this repository? So since we're a subject of metaphors over here, I have a couple of my own. So I see culture as a vehicle on which different civilizations can ride on, right? For example, in India, the civilizations, the drivers are the Harappa civilization, the Mauryans, the Guptas, Chalukyas, Cholas, Pandyas, Vijayanagar, Maratha. So many civilizations you could say, and each of them used this Bharatiya culture, right? That was their vehicle on which they drove. And we can see that just like if you think of a vehicle today, you can't have a vehicle without maintenance. You don't maintain your vehicle, it's going to die. Similarly, culture too needs maintenance from each civilization that uses it. Every civilization enriched it. Every civilization added to that culture, enriched it more and more. That's what we see in the Indian culture. So I see culture as a vehicle and civilization as a driver. A second metaphor is when we see culture as civilization's operating system, right? We live in the digital age and we love this word, operating system. And this is the civilization's operating system is its culture. So we can now take a look at culture in its dimensions, the various dimensions, and I have identified 8 dimensions of Indian culture. To start with, like I told you, the worldview on causality, time, and so on. It's knowledge and sciences, the institutions that the culture evolves, the ethics and the values, aesthetics and arts, economics and technology, the transmission, and the collective memory. We can study the Bharatiya culture along each of these dimensions, and each gives us some additional insight on what this is all about. Excuse me. If you look at the first dimension, or the worldview and cosmology, the key insight is Indians saw recurrent creation and destruction cycles, an infinite universe, and causality. They were not superstitious. They were not saying things happen just because it does so. Everything required a cause and effect, Vaisheshika in effect, like perception and inference. They wanted to see what causes something to happen, and they tried to explain it with the physics that they understood and so on. So we see, for example, in Surya Siddhanta, where time is measured in fractions of a second to billions of years. For example, the Thruti was 29 microseconds. One might imagine, what on earth, how did they even measure that? The physicists in us will ask that question. How could they measure that, right? So from there, we see all the way to a Kalpa, which is 4.32 billion years, or a day of Brahma, in which he brings up the creation, and a night of Brahma, in which dissolution too happens, for a total of about 8.3264 billion years. Indians evolved cosmological cycles, the yugas, the kalpas, the manvantaras. These are huge temporal scales. And astronomy was developed to have a celestial clock. The sky was seen as a celestial clock to keep track of time, to keep track of the passage of time in terms of years, yugas, muhurtas, and so on and so forth. And it was used for everyday timekeeping. It was highly refined, and Indians had a calibrated approach to everyday life. There was a muhurta to do things, and you better have a precise way of measuring that muhurta. That's what drove most of these things. And cosmology underpins ethics, ecology, and social organization. Like we heard from the keynote address today by the professor here, that he talked about how Yajurveda says, as in the macrocosm, so in the microcosm. Those are the kind of ideas that evolved in the civilization to do these kind of things. And metaphysics is integrated into daily life and not separated from science. Very, very important to see that one point. And throughout this talk, I'm also going to contrast it with how the West saw culture. In the West, time has a beginning with a creation event, and there's an end with an apocalypse, right? So there's a creation event, apocalypse. You only live once, it's a linear time. Whereas here, time is recurrent. In the second dimension, we see the knowledge systems and sciences. And the key insight is science was not separated from culture. it was holistically and deeply integrated into everyday practice, whether it is mathematics with place value, or the Shilva Sutras, or geometry, and so on, Bhaskara II up to Madhava working on algebra, calculus, astronomy, and so on, combinatorics, or Aryabhata's Kutaka algorithm. Every one of it was not done for the sake of doing these things, but had an application, had a understanding in the Indian way of life. In astronomy, we see Aryabhatiya with planetary models, Surya Siddhanta of celestial computations, planetary orbits, and so on, calendar systems, and so on. In medicine, Ayurveda with holistic health systems, Sushruta, surgery, Charaka, internal medicine, Vagbhata with preventive medicine, we see these things. And many other sciences too, metallurgy, linguistics, ecology, maritime. And once again, if we contrast it with how science has developed in the West, we see that science was and continues to be in conflict in Western culture because it requires secularization. There is no way you can take it holistically with the culture of the land because you'll have to secularize it. Otherwise, there's no way you can reconcile what you have with what is mandated and what is set in stone, literally. In the third dimension, institutions and social organizations, the key insight is social institutions evolved, ensuring stability, purpose, and well-being. We are seeing things like the Shreni were the guilds that were set up by traders, merchants, artisans, and so on. And they regulated all aspects of that industry. And whatever wealth was got was reinvested in public works like temples, like tanks, like chatrams where travelers could stay, hospitals, and these kinds of things. They took care of these things. The matas were monastic institutions that functioned as universities. They generated philosophical knowledge. They had the Guru Sishya, the teacher-disciple transmission system, and there were centers of learning and debate. Scholars went all over the country debating in places like this. The Gurukulas were residential schools in a teacher's household, holistic education, scriptures, character formation with academics, and decentralized knowledge creation. And the family system itself was a strong institution that had a social bedrock. It functioned to preserve cultural memory, to reinforce the daily practice, as well as intergenerational knowledge transfer. And once again, we contrast it with the West. What we see is feudal structures, basically the church and the nobility, they control the peasants who had absolutely nothing for a pretty long time. Until perhaps the 18th to 19th centuries, this stifled knowledge institutions. Knowledge was a preserve of the church and the nobility. In the cultural dimension 4, ethics and values in the dharmic framework, the key insight is dharmic systems provided the intellectual framework for practical, ethical living and ecological harmony in addition. So we see that dharma, in this, we see the framework for ethical actions. It binds individual duty, social harmony, cosmic order, and it's karma. We see that as a law of cause and effect, right? It dignifies every action as spiritually significant. Ahimsa, we know non-violence is a foundational ethical principle, and rhythm or satya is a cosmic truth and natural order that is there in all creation. Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. The whole world is one family, this kind of a harmonious universal ethical vision, and the Pancha Mahabhuta reverence. So this has a sacred ecology, the 5 elements of the foundation for sustainable living itself. And once again, in contrast, we see Western culture tries to exploit and control nature, seeing it as divinely permitted, right? Because God has created man in his image and put him in charge of all creation. So we see this kind of a thinking in this culture and the other over here. In the 5th dimension, aesthetics and artistic expression, we see that art is not just for entertainment, it truly is embodied cosmology. We are seeing in temple architecture, whether it is Vastu, sacred geometry, symmetry, resonance, astronomical alignment, we see that in every temple. In music, in raga and thala, we see mathematical structures, they encode emotions. Each raga is associated with time of the day, seasons, moods, and so on. Natya Shastra, unified framework for aesthetics, psychology, for geometry, acoustics, ethics, everything in one system. And literature itself, we got a huge corpus of works from Vedic hymns to the epics, whether it's Ramayana, Mahabharata, and all these things encode civilizational wisdom. And in contrast, even today we see this, Western art is historically weaponized to impose class boundaries. The people who appreciate a certain kind of Western classical music, or the people who like a certain kind of rap music, we see a huge difference in society and divisions because of these kinds of distinctions. In the cultural dimension for economics and technology, we have the word of Angus Madison, who's a historical economist, who says that around the 1500s, Indians had about 25% of the world's GDP, in contrast to Europe, which was at that time around 15% of the world GDP. And we see that economic and technological achievements are absolutely necessary for a culture to prosper, right? Does not prosper in isolation over here. And we see that agriculture, thanks to regular monsoons in India, you had a well-developed farming system. Metallurgy, we got evidence from 3000 BC itself, metalworks over here, high carbon steel, textiles, fine muslin, dyeing with global demand, maritime trade, networks from the east to Southeast Asia and west to Arabia and Rome, and urban centers, whether it's Mohenjo-daro, Harappa, Keeladi, and several other places, we're seeing advanced city planning in these areas, and cottage industries with decentralized artisanal production. And once again, if we contrast with the West, we see following the fall of the Roman Empire and the onset of the Dark Ages, approximately 330 current era, when Constantine adopted Christianity, we see Europe was stifled by feudal structures, and this limited commercial activity till the so-called industrialization of the West. And that's why you see less than 15% of the world GDP at this particular period of time. In the seventh dimension, the transmission mechanisms, the key insight is Indian knowledge survived thousands of years despite invasions, destruction of libraries, and colonial suppression. And this is because we had the Guru Sishya Parampara, a sacred lineage transmitting knowledge orally with unbroken fidelity across thousands of years. And we see in the Vedangas, 6 auxiliary disciplines preserving recitation of the phonetics, Siksha, Chandas, Vyakarana, Nirukta, Kalpa, Jyotisha, all of these things allowed that to happen. Samskaras and rituals, the practices, the life cycle rites, these served as experiential learning, cultural memory embodied in practice instead of formal instruction. And we are seeing for festivals, annual cycles of festivals that encode astronomy, ecology, stories, and so on. In decentralization, knowledge distributed across different families, guilds, temples, and matas, these survive because there's no single point in failure. We see that in the West, when the Library of Alexandria was destroyed, or when the so-called pagan libraries are destroyed in Greece and so on, all knowledge is wiped out, right? But in India, the invaders could not do that. You had to go to every single temple in every single village. There were millions of them, and you had to break them, and it was an impossible task. So knowledge survived. Secondly, even though the libraries were burnt and the scholars were killed, precise memorization through structured oral transmission, the Kramapatha and others, this was reliable, and even without written texts of millennia, this knowledge survived. And in contrast, in Western culture, knowledge is the preserve of the clergy and the nobility. The final dimension here, collective memory, the Itihasas and Puranas, the key insight is these are civilizational databases that are encoded in narrative form. We need to see that these texts are not mythology. They contain encapsulated wisdom and metaphors. If you have the key to unlock the wisdom, suddenly the wisdom becomes clear. If you don't have the key to unlock that wisdom, your understanding remains at a pedestrian level where you say that all of this is mythology and so on. So we see that these are repositories of genealogies, dynastic histories, mathematical, scientific principles, astronomical calendars, timekeeping, geography, ethical governance frameworks, philosophy, medical, ecological knowledge, performing arts. So these are veritably encyclopedic works. Any Purana that you take is like an encyclopedia. It contains all of this kind of information. And the key insight here is Indian culture preserves collective memory in narratives that must be decoded to reveal the rigorous encoded meanings. If you take it at the level of mythology, our understanding remains over there. But if you understand the key to unlock wisdom, yep, it's very, very clear. So this decentralized practice is what made it robust. So I'm going to change tack over here. So we talked about the Indian culture, how it was a vehicle on which several Indian civilizations rode on. The question that we should ask today is, what happened? What happened to this culture today? We don't see that. So we got to understand about Western devastation of Indian culture, and we need to understand how the West defines its own culture. Well, the West has got a dichotomy over here. It sees itself in two ways. One is it takes upon itself the Greco-Roman rationalism, which if you attend my talks, you'll understand how strongly Greece was connected with India, whether we talk with Plato, Pythagoras, Pyrrhon, or Democritus and others. We understand how deeply they were tied with Indian thought, and we have several evidences for that. So we see logic and empirical sciences as a root of all knowledge. Greek philosophy is exalted as the origin of civilization. Any Western book on the history of science will obligatorily exalt the Greeks as the origin of all science, knowledge, and so on. Science versus religion is an ongoing conflict, unfortunately. And you see that universal templates derived from European experiences imposed on the world. It is taken as a standard against which every other civilization should be measured against. And that leads to an exceedingly distorted view of the world. They also have this Abrahamic theology where linear time, creation, history, apocalypse, and morality is seen as divine commands with absolute truth has been claimed. We see notions of sin, salvation, chosen people, monotheistic, absolutism, one God, one truth. And we need to have a secular religious divide institutionalized, or you cannot reconcile science over here. So we see one truth, one God, our ways. And because of this, Western culture has had to separate religion from science. It is not holistic like Indian sciences. It has got to separate these two things. Culture in the West is seen as human expression, behavior, symbols, social organization. It is not seen as a knowledge system. That is why Western culture cannot recognize Indic knowledge on its own terms. It imposes its categories on Indian culture, and consequently you got translations like H.H. Wilson or like Max and Weber and so many other people who distort every single thing there is to talk about Vedic sciences, culture, and so on, because they fail to see the metaphoric content over here. They see science with culture. So the damage and deracination due to their universalism is enormous, enormous. It persists to the present day. For example, colonial voices, James Mill, who reduced Hindu rituals as grossest superstition, absurd and frivolous in the highest degree. Macaulay, a single shelf of a good European library is worth the whole native literature of India and Arabia. Or you have Max Muller, who said mythology is a disease of language, rejected the metaphysical symbolism in Vedic literature. And Monier Williams, he saw idolatry as the very life and soul of Hinduism, and iconoclastic theological rejection has taken place over there. What has this resulted in? The harm done. We have today Aryan invasion or migration. This theory is inserted race as a driver of social stratification in India. I have spent more than 20 years talking about this topic in my talks. So please do search for my name on YouTube and you can see some of my talks where I've unpacked this one with scientific evidence, and I have a lot to say on this. The Europeans had something called casta, thanks to their experience in Americas and so on. And they imposed this on the mobile Jati, Varna, Kulam, Gotra. This is what Indians had. All of this was conflated as caste, right? So this is done thanks to the European works over here. Vedic culture was framed as mythology, superstition, idolatry, and primitive rituals. And these categories were institutionalized in Western, and very unfortunately in Nehruvian India, this was institutionalized in our education policies too. And generations of Indians have been educated to see their civilizational inheritance through these bigoted lenses. And we are seeing forced compartmentalization. Whereas Indian knowledge is holistic, we are seeing over here yoga as fitness, Ayurveda's alternative medicine, Vedanta's abstract philosophy. It's gone away completely from the holistic understanding that Indians had. And the symbols have been stripped of their multi-layered meaning. If you see Nirukta in Yaska's works, he talks about how every Vedic work has got a multi-dimensional understanding, right? But every symbol has been stripped away and reduced to myth or literalism. The result today is we have civilizational insecurity in Hindus, needing Western validation and their own embarrassment about their cultural symbols. This is such an unfortunate consequence at last to the present day. And in my talks, I've shown how the distortion of Indian history and identity has been done because these frameworks have been imposed on our historiography. The colonial lens, the Eurocentric lens, the missionary lens, the socialist, the Nehruvian academic lens, and the Marxists since 1972, they've imposed their own. So we see the history of India has been hijacked, and they've imposed their ideologies, and they've resulted in a subversion of our identities. That's why none of you can recognize your ancestors or your civilizational history if you were to see these works resulting from their works. But there's a silver lining. So there is a resilient Indian culture, and I want to talk to you about that. It's not a defeated note over here. We see that Vedic culture can be understood in 3 dimensions. The first dimension is that of karma kanda. This is a ritual and procedural dimension. If you see the Vedas, everything over there is a sacrifice to some deity, right? It's a ritual that you see at every sentence over there. What we're seeing is every ritual is encoding, is a cosmic ritual encoding astronomical timing. There are ecological principles embedded in each of them. There are metaphysical notions of self-transformation. And the conduct is refined through practice. The discipline that you have to perform a ritual correctly day after day after day, that imposes this kind of a refined conduct over here. Yamas and niyamas, these are ethical preparation, good works, good thoughts. Every day that I have it takes me to a sattvika frame of mind, and that leads me to a higher understanding and so on. That is what we see in the karma kanda. In the upasana kanda, it was meant to be a contemplative worship. It was my identification with my Ishta Devata, because I cannot conceptualize a Nirguna Brahman over there, which is a formless Brahman. I want a Brahman with a form in my Ishta Devata, right? For example, if I'm a wrestler, I might want to pray to Hanuman in my studio. If I'm a dancer, I might want to pray to Nataraja. If I'm a scholar, I might want to worship Saraswati. So these are attributes of the divinity that I want to see reflected in myself. Attributes of the divinity that I want to see reflected in myself. So we're seeing that these are contemplative works, internalization of the symbolic meaning, contemplative identification with cosmos, and this enhances meditative depth. We're supposed to go into meditation over here, meditating on the deity that we are interested in. I've had friends in India who have done deep meditation, and they say they've actually seen Devi, they've actually seen Saraswati, they've actually seen these deities, right? That's the amount of strength they have in their meditation. It bridges this karma and jnana. It strengthens the inquiring mind. The Jnana Kanda is the insight and ultimate reality. It's the direct experience of Brahman. It is Paravidya. It illuminates the meaning of ritual. Every ritual we do has got a meaning, and Jnana is the one that illuminates that. The Vedic insight that we see, for example, in Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, is that Paravidya is superior to Aparavidya. This transforms the habit into awareness and makes culture truly transformative. So the key insight here is each dimension supports the other two, and that is the beauty of the Vedic culture. So given that I talked about deracination, enormous deracination in the Indian context today, it really means the jnana is gone. We don't have jnana. We have no idea why we are worshipping. We have no idea why we are doing these rituals, right? So what happens when jnana is gone? What is the consequence of lost knowledge? Karma becomes transactional, right? We see rituals are reduced to bargaining with the deity. I will perform a ritual, therefore I must obtain a reward, right? You go to Ganapati and say, I'll break 10 coconuts and I need this reward from you, kind of a situation. So we see this, or even worse, Ritual collapses into superstition. If you don't have the jnana, it becomes superstition. And we see so many of our youth completely abandoning this because they've been taught to think this is superstition. And we see upasanas become begging, supplication, where you beg the deity. Contemplative identification is replaced by petition. Meditative depth is lost. The deity is seen as an external wish fulfiller. That is how we see our deities today. And the procedures have rigidified when jnana has gone out of karma. When karma is gone, procedural authority loses sight of understanding. When I don't have, let me finish. When I don't have understanding, then I try to make things very, very rigid. And the spirit of inquiry is gone, and symbols become opaque. And we have several drivers of jnana lost today. And the good news is that culture survived despite the loss of jnana, because we continued to perform the karma kanda. We did the rituals. We didn't know the meaning, but every temple did that. Every temple, we had pujaris who would say the mantras. We'd blindly say all of the Sanskritam mantras and so on. They preserved the skeletal framework of our system. It is waiting to be illuminated by jnana. Once jnana comes in, it can illuminate all of these karma kandas. And today, the contemporary influence, the cultural vacuum has been filled by a cinematic neo-culture and a foreign cultural aping. Like I said, culture is dynamic. It is what the civilization makes out of it. And today we see that these are the kind of things where cinematic weddings, for example, they become aspiration templates for our people, market-driven spectacles, and so on. The distinction is Vedic culture embeds metaphysical meaning, whereas cinematic or alien culture exalts visual forms without a metaphysical depth. And there are several parts of decolonization, which is recovery of knowledge frameworks, not a political agitation, to reframe the rituals, symbolic literacy, reconnect the three dimensions, and learning Sanskritam to gain sovereignty to interpret our own texts and avoid reliance on distorted Western transmissions and so on. So, like I said, we need to understand why we do the festivals, what is Ayurveda, how does it relate to ecology, mathematics and music, the epistemology in Sanskritam, so we don't reduce our terms to Western theological vocabulary and so on. And there are institutions that should play a role in cultural resurgence. For example, traditional institutions, modern institutions like Chinmaya Mission, Ramakrishna Mission, Hindu University, and several others, and the family itself. So we need to see disciplined scholarship with humility, avoiding self-discipline and uncritical glorification. This is what allows true recovery. I've shown that over here. On one side, you got the completely deracinated dismissal of everything Hindus, saying it's rituals, it's superstition, and everything needs Western validation before accepting Indian knowledge, and so on. On the other extreme, we see uncritical glorification, overcompensation, replacing analysis with slogans, uncritical WhatsApp media and social media forwards, glorifying things with no meaning at all, absurdities, extravagant, unverified claims. We need a middle path where there's disciplined scholarship with humility, evidence-based understanding. That gives us a true cultural recovery. So in summary, I hope I've been able to make a case for you that the Indian culture is a knowledge continuum. The Bharatiya civilization is a knowledge-centric civilization. It is not folklore. It is a rich, coherent knowledge system integrating sciences, ethics, arts, cosmology across several thousands and thousands of years. And we need to see it through Indic lenses rather than Western categories. It's got resilience because the decentralization has taken place, and the path to resurgence of our culture to revive the jnana while honoring the karma and upasana. That is the path to a meaningful transformation. So the key takeaway is culture is knowledge plus worldview plus practice, sustained, transmitted, and evolved across many centuries. And concluding insight is that although we have a juxtaposition of the modern along with the ancient in India, they can coexist with absolutely no embarrassment about who we are, what our culture is. So we have to see that rituals are preserved, a structural core of our civilization's knowledge. Infusion of jnana enriches karma and upasana, creating a coherent transformative cultural framework. This will dissolve the embarrassment of ignorance, clarity of understanding. India should be seen as a living, knowledge-centric civilization. It's not a relic of the past. So you got to participate in culture with awareness, recover symbolic literacy, revive jnana. It's for no reason that in 3000 BCE, Rishi Yajnavalkya in Brihadaranyaka he said this, Asatoma Sadgamaya, Tamasoma Jyotirgamaya. He said, lead me from darkness to light. So this is a civilization that exalted the seeking of knowledge as the ultimate goal in life. So it's a dispelling of avidya with idvidya. So you can only do that with knowledge. So this shows for thousands of years, this has been the pursuit of this civilization. If you're interested in more of this, there's a paper I wrote on this for a conference in Kerala. You can download it with this QR. Okay, thank you very much. Namaste. Namaste.